Part 2. Monday the 3rd of November, 1969. Chapter 54. Hunkered down upon the hill, the vicarage slept nervously in the storm. The last remnant of flame spluttered out, and the fireplace fell cold. Soon the chill of the night encroached on the village. Eventually the cold stirred the vicar, Aldous Squires, from his sleep. He lifted his head, trying to work out where he was. He then tried to work out why he was asleep in the front room. He noticed an unfamiliar lump in front of the remains of the fire, and the events of the night were returned to his tired mind. He sleepily rebuilt the fire, piling on more coal once the flames were settled. He found extra blankets which he loaded onto his visitor before returning to his own bed. Once he was settled again, he lay awake, unable to sleep despite the hour. He prayed long and hard for an answer to the man's riddle. Part of him was excited. The unexpected visitor injected a much-prayed-for chance for doing good, and he thought perhaps his prayers had been answered. The strangeness of his appearance on his doorstep could be a sign, he thought, he hoped. Another part of him, however, the part that spoke louder, was his responsible side. He was, or wanted to be, a respected member of the community. Housing a potential criminal, however well-tailored their suits might be, was not the behaviour of such a respected person. He resigned himself regrettably to the conclusion that in the morning he would have to go into town and find a policeman. As he lay in his gradually warming bed, he played the next day out in his head over and over. He pictured giving his statement to the policeman and what he would say. He replayed the events of the night over in his mind and rehearsed the story to ensure he could recall every moment. As he did so, his eyes drifted closed, and the night crept on. He only realised he had drifted off to sleep when he woke up again. From the grey out of his window he could see it was late morning. The day was as bright as it would get. This time, when he awoke, he remembered the man as soon as he opened his eyes. He dressed as quickly as he could and rushed down to the living room. White embers at the end of their reserve glowed in the fireplace, and before them, still snoring, was the blanket-covered man. He was drier, as were his clothes, though they would require washing before he could wear them again. Aldous ate half a slice of toast, watching him sleep, wondering what happened. When he was ready, he strolled down into town, and quickly happened upon a man stalking around the Firestone roundabout suspiciously. He watched him for a while, trying to fathom what he might be doing as he dodged cars and scribbled notes. He then noticed Drew on the roundabout watching him, and nodded to him in recognition. Drew was an enigma to him. He knew the stories of his father, and he had heard the rumours about Banks' part in his death. He wondered what sort of dangerous game he was playing under the scrutiny of Banks, and wondered if he needed a friend. Drew seemed cold and unapproachable, but he decided to make an effort nonetheless. "Hello, Drew, isn't it?" Aldous asked, admiring his tall helmet. "Yes, father, nice to see you again," Drew replied, though the vicar doubted he meant it. Drew was a little unapproachable, though he did everything he could to display professional demeanour. "Who is he?" Aldous watched as the man stomped here and there, producing strange-looking objects from his bag. "He's an inspector down from Scotland Yard." This didn't quite satisfy Aldous' curiosity. "What's he doing?" he asked. Suddenly the vicar saw something familiar about the man. Inspecting. Aldous watched him skirting the road, reading his instruments. He had seen him before, but he could not fathom when. "Why is he here?" Aldous asked, trying to place him. "There was a body discovered last night in the copse. He has been sent to investigate." Aldous froze. Could the man asleep on his living room floor be responsible? He studied the inspector again, and suddenly realised who it was he reminded him of. He shook his head in disbelief. How could this be? "A body, my word," Aldous said, trying to hide his train of thought for a moment. "Did you notice anything last night, Vicar? Anything you want to talk about?" Drew had noticed. He was a sharp one, Aldous realised. "No." He realised that he had been right from the start. Something was happening, and he should help the man without police assistance. He couldn't quite work out what brought him to this decision, but he knew it was the right one, despite the risks and the body. "I'm a very deep sleeper. I didn't even realise how bad the storm had been last night until I left the vicarage a few minutes ago to walk into town. Parts of the roads are almost flooded." He indicated back up the road towards the vicarage, but his attention did not leave the inspector. The familiarity was uncanny. "Were there any casualties? Any damage? Anything like that?" Aldous asked, playing for more time to clarify his instinct. "No reports I'm aware of. I'm sure if anyone needed your services they would know where to find you." Drew wondered what he found so fascinating. "I hope so," Aldous replied. The more he saw of the man, the more sure he was right. The inspector approached finally, and suddenly Aldous felt nervous speaking to him. "Good afternoon." The inspector shook Aldous' hand. "I'm sure Drew has told you about me. I'm an inspector down from Scotland Yard." "Good afternoon. I'm Aldous Squires, Firestone's vicar," Aldous replied, staring into his eyes. "Pleased to make your acquaintance." The inspector shot a look at Drew, noticing the vicar's behaviour. "I'm here to investigate the appearance of a body in the woods last night. Did you notice anything untoward around the hours of midnight and 2 a.m? "No," Aldous replied, a little too quickly, he thought. Paranoia began to edge into his mind as he realised he needed to get back to the man on his floor. As I was just telling Drew here, I slept quite deeply. I wasn't even awoken by the storm, which by all accounts was dreadful, he said quickly, wanting to go. Yes, fortunately no one was hurt. The three men stood for a moment in silence. Aldous was now too scared to flee in case it looked suspicious. An interesting stone, Father. Any clues of its origins? The inspector asked. The vicar balked a little. He regarded it briefly. Well, the stories I've heard is that it was used to sacrifice people, hence the red coloration. Though I know little more of it than that, he informed him, hoping this would suffice. Yes, this is all anyone seems to know about it. There was an awkward silence, and Aldous wished he had the courage to leave them and walk back to his cottage. Well, nice talking to you, Father. The inspector finally released him, and the vicar sighed inwardly. If anything about last night does spring to mind, please contact me via the police station. Oh yes, of course. Aldous felt he would have agreed to anything at that moment to escape. Well, Drew, we'd best be off, the inspector informed him. Indeed, and I have some matters at the vicarage I must attend to, Aldous told them gratefully. Goodbye, Inspector. See you again soon, I'm sure, he told them quickly. As he stepped into the road, Mr. Jones' empty bread van raced past, nearly knocking him off his feet. My goodness, Father, are you all right? The inspector was first on the scene as the van sped away. Yes, I'm fine, thank you, he lied. Aldous felt as though the last few hours' excitement was perhaps all a little too much for him. I'm sorry, I really must be off, he managed to blurt out, before he finally escaped and raced back up the hill, a little shaken from his near collision with Mr. Jones the baker. He walked in a daze, dumbfounded and confused. It couldn't be, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He scuttled up the path. The street was bordered on both sides by lazy cottages set back from the road with gravel drives and neat gardens. Hello, Aldous, Mrs. Tarbuck called him as they passed. She stood, empty wicker basket in hand, and watched him pass her. Yes, hello, he managed to reply, along with the conventional smile and nod. His pace didn't slack. He continued up the road unabated. Well, I wonder what's gotten into him, Mrs. Tarbuck muttered to herself as she hurried down to the shops. The grey sky hung overhead, and an icy chill occasionally flustered down Firestone's quiet streets. Aldous' attention was distracted, his mind awash with questions. He reached the vicarage and hurried through the squeaky gate of his cottage. As he rushed down the path of the well-tended garden, he fumbled in his pocket for his key. He reached the low-slung building and quickly let himself in. He closed and locked the door behind him, drawing the curtain that hung behind it to block any draught. He went through all this as an act of concealment. He was trying to hide the cottage's contents. Now safely back, he realised how exhausted he was and stopped to catch his breath. His old bones felt the effects of exertion more than they used to, and his pace up the hill had been quicker than usual. His walk had been accelerated by the confusion that swam around in his mind, and his eagerness to check on the strange visitor that had arrived during the night that he had left sleeping on his living room floor. The likeness between his visitor and the inspector he had just met was eerie. He felt as though he was being made a fool of, or his sanity was being severely strained. He took off his hat and coat and hung them on their hook behind the door. He strained his hearing, listening to the humble cottage, trying to sense if the man was still there. He walked softly and gently down the low corridor to the lounge where he had left the man sleeping. Much to Aldous' surprise, the man was no longer asleep, but sat bolt upright, looking about the room in a dazed fashion. Aldous cautiously sat down in his usual chair behind the man's line of sight. "Hello," he said, as confidently as he could, trying to hide the shaking in his voice. Suddenly, he felt very nervous about having this man in his house, an intruder inside his solitary world. The man turned slowly to face Aldous. "Hello," the man replied. His voice was coarse and weak. He was grey, washed out, his eyes sunken. The room was small, like all the rooms in the ancient house. The man and his makeshift bed almost filled it. "Who are you?" Aldous asked, gaining a little confidence at the sight of the bedraggled man. He opened and closed his mouth, rubbing his dry tongue against the mouth's roof, trying to create some saliva for his dry throat. "I'm afraid," he replied wearily, "that I have no idea of whom or where I am." Aldous frowned doubtfully. "Well, you look uncannily like a chap I've just had a conversation with at Firestone roundabout. An inspector, apparently, down from Scotland Yard." Aldous held his ground, his bravery gathering. "Inspector? Yes, that sounds familiar." A moment of recognition flashed across his face. "What is he here to inspect?" the man asked. "Well, I'm not entirely sure what he was inspecting at the roundabout, but a body was discovered in the copse last night, and the man at the roundabout, is here to investigate it." "Why do you think that he is me?" The man thought for a moment, trying desperately to find reason. How is that possible? He seemed genuinely confused to Aldous, who studied him closely. Although holding an undoubted similarity to the inspector, the two men did look slightly different. Besides having a layer of facial hair, this man was greyer, his features were drawn out. His face was longer and his eyes were set deeper and had a morose expression. "Well, you look similar, that's all," Aldous replied after a moment of thought. Doubt began to creep into the edges of his mind as he considered the impossibility of it all. The man seemed to have already forgotten about their conversation. His eyes had begun wandering disinterestedly around the room. Another difference Aldous noticed between them was that the inspector was obviously keen-eyed and intelligent, whereas this man acted as if drunk or heavily sedated. "Perhaps I could get you something to eat," Aldous offered kindly. "All right," said the man, not quite seeming to know how to react, or, indeed, what Aldous even meant. Aldous put together some ham sandwiches and poured him a glass of water. As he was feeling peckish, he decided to have a sandwich too. The man studied the food on his plate, not picking it up. It looked to Aldous as if he wasn't sure what to do with the sandwich at all. The man watched Aldous eating a few mouthfuls, then tried it for himself. He soon got the hang of it, and quickly devoured the sandwich as if he hadn't eaten for days. "Is there more?" he asked desperately when every crumb had been cleared from the plate. "Yes, hold on." Aldous returned to the kitchen and prepared some soup from a can, which he gave to the man with a half-sliced loaf. He wolfed the lot down eagerly. Aldous brought him more water, his heart softening towards him. When he had drunk a gallon, almost without taking breath, he looked up at Aldous. "I think I need to lie down again," he informed him. "You can sleep upstairs, there's a spare bedroom." Aldous stood to try and guide him up, but the man staggered back to the living room and collapsed onto his makeshift bed. He was asleep before his body hit the cushions. Aldous watched him for a few minutes, but he did not stir. When he was sure the man wasn't going to rise again, Aldous cleared up the plates and bowls, washing them and replacing them in their cupboards, before returning to the living room. He sat in his chair and waited for him to wake up, but the man remained unconscious for the rest of the day. Eventually Aldous grew tired and slipped off to sleep himself. He woke in the evening and rebuilt the fire. He had dinner and read a book as he did most evenings. He left the man to rest. He managed to stay awake until 10 before he gave in. He stocked the fire generously, then took himself off to his bed, leaving the comatose man alone again. Tuesday the 4th of November 1969. Chapter 55. Aldous awoke early the next day. He quickly dressed and descended the stairs to find the man still asleep on his floor. He had half hoped, half expected, for him to have been gone this morning, and had mixed feelings about seeing him still there. Seeing him still asleep on his floor made him wonder just what kind of trouble he might be in, and what he might be letting himself into. He left him to sleep and went through to the kitchen, where he began making bacon and eggs. He closed the cupboards with a little extra vigour. He rattled plates and cups. However, despite the racket he created, the man didn't stir. As the bacon fried, it filled the house with the most delicious odour, and as Aldous began to busy himself with the eggs, the man suddenly appeared at the kitchen doorway in his dirtied but dry clothes. Aldous was quite startled to see him suddenly stood there, and jumped at the sight of him. Without a word, he walked in and sat down at the kitchen table. The sensation of having someone else in his house was a little unsettling to Aldous, but he tried to put these feelings aside. "That smells good," the man said simply. "Would you like some? I've made enough for you," Aldous told him. "Oh, thank you," the man replied hoarsely. "You're welcome." Aldous studied him. He was beginning to recover his colour a little. The food and water yesterday had obviously done him some good. "I've never seen someone sleep for so long, or so deeply. Are you a drunk?" The man looked about him as he had done yesterday. He didn't seem to have heard Aldous. "How long have I been here?" he asked. "You arrived Sunday night. Well, very early Monday morning, to be precise. It is now Tuesday morning." Aldous paused. "Do you know where you are today?" The man's eyes thinned suspiciously. "Have we already spoken? Have I been awake already?" His glance darted around the room as he tried to recognise something. "You don't remember waking yesterday? You don't remember speaking to me?" Aldous asked, a little concerned. "No," his guest replied morosely, leaning his elbows on the table and burying his head in his hands. He massaged his tired eyes with his palms. Aldous stood and began cooking the eggs. "Well, what is the last thing you can remember?" he asked him as the eggs and bacon from Johnson's Butcher's fried enticingly. The man looked around the kitchen. "Waking up in there a few minutes ago," he gestured towards the living room. "Do you know who you are?" There was a moment of silence while the man tried to recall something about his identity. "No, nor exactly where I am, except for being in your house," he replied eventually with disdain. Aldous took pity on him. "You're in the village of Firestone," he reminded him, "and you are recuperating from whatever has happened to you in the vicarage of Firestone." Aldous paused in thought for a second, and the man picked up a fleeting moment of doubt. What is it?" he asked him, dreading what else he could have to contend with. "Well, it's just that there is already somebody visiting the town, someone who looks very similar to you. I met him yesterday on my way to the police station to inform them that I had a strange man asleep on my lounge floor." "Oh," the man replied, then realised who he meant. "Oh," he said again, rather more forlornly. "I didn't, however, make it as far as the police station before I met young Constable Gates, and your doppelganger, taking some kind of reading at the Firestone. When I saw how similar the two of you looked, something told me that I shouldn't tell the police, so I came back to check on you." He looked the confused man up and down. "I hope I made the right decision." Aldous studied the man's face, his build. As he recovered from whatever ordeal he had been through, he was beginning to look more like the man he had met yesterday, save for the hair sprouting from his cheeks, neck and chin. "But that would be impossible," the man replied, not sounding wholly convinced to himself or to Aldous. "How can I possibly be in two places at once?" "Well, indeed, that appears to be the question." Aldous was confused, but convinced that they were the same person. The men were too alike in too many ways for him to accept that they weren't the same man, no matter what the consequences of that might mean. He presented the inspector with a plate full of eggs, bacon and toast, which he immediately began to devour. He made short work of it, pausing only to glug down water from a jug that Aldous had placed on the table. When he had finished, Aldous picked up his plate. The food was obviously doing him good. He sat for a while rubbing his stomach, looking satisfied. "Would you like anything else?" Aldous asked when he noticed he had gained some colour in his cheeks. The man thought for a moment. "Yes, sugar. Do you have any sweets, chocolate, anything like that?" he asked, his voice a little brighter. Aldous rummaged in a cupboard above the worktops for a moment, and eventually produced a white paper bag of cola cubes. "These have been in the cupboard for a while. Please help yourself." The inspector began putting them in his mouth two at a time and crunching them. "Would you happen to have any tea?" he asked when he got through half of the bag. "Of course," Aldous replied, as if he should have thought of it himself. He stood and filled the kettle, then placed it on the stove. Within a few minutes the two men were holding steaming cups of strong, sweet tea. "That's better," the inspector informed him between mouthfuls. When he wasn't drinking tea, he sat chomping on cola cubes at a leisurely fashion. "You seem to have a good appetite and a sweet tooth," Aldous noticed. "I think I've lost a lot of my body's natural sugars," he explained, feeling much more like himself. "Judging by how I feel and how emaciated I am, I would say I haven't had anything to eat or drink for about 4 days. Aldous gawped. "Why haven't you starved to death?" he asked, a little surprised. "There are ways of preventing these things from happening," the inspector replied vaguely. "Well, you certainly look like you'd not eaten for a while. How was the food?" "Delicious, and much needed." He glugged down a mouthful of tea, then threw more sweets into his mouth. "I presume whatever caused my absence from food and water also caused my amnesia, though things are slowly beginning to come back to me." The inspector suddenly stopped crunching. "What day did you say it was today?" He tried to hide his trepidation at the answer. "Tuesday," Aldous replied. For a moment the inspector lost his colour again, before recovering and continuing to crunch his sweets thoughtfully. "The 11th?" he asked hopefully. "No, the 4th. Have you remembered something?" Aldous asked. "Something important?" The inspector had realised that he had been thrown 3 days into the past, and that it had taken him about 4 days to get here. The inspector sat, eyes closed, and tried to work out what he was going to do. The vicar saw he was buried deep in thought, so poured them both another cup of tea and pushed one towards the ruminating inspector. Finally he opened his eyes and turned to face the vicar. "How rigid is your view of the world we live in, Father?" Aldous did not know how to reply. This was not quite what he had been expecting. He opened his mouth, but when no words were forthcoming, the inspector elaborated. "As a man of the cloth, you may fall into one of two categories. On the one hand, you may be open to new ideas, fresh views on a beautiful, if not bewildering, world, or you may be so distracted by the word of your holy book that you will squeeze all occurrences, no matter how fervently against your beliefs the evidence suggests they might be, into an explanation that fits the scripture, but isn't entirely comparable with the apparent evidence." The inspector paused for Aldous to answer. The vicar thought carefully. "I think I may sit somewhere in the middle," he replied after a cautious pause, feeling somehow a trap was being set. "I don't believe that everything can be explained by the Bible," he continued, "but I do believe that all natural things, no matter how cruel or incomprehensible they might seem to human eyes, have come from God. He has a plan for it all, a plan so massive and intricate that to try and understand it would drive you to madness. It has come, after all, from the mind of God." He paused to point a finger at the ceiling. No mortal could ever hope to understand it. Aldous smiled, satisfied that this summed up his opinion and his way of life. The inspector nodded, satisfied. This was his faith, this was his life, and the inspector had no intention of taking that from him. "Well, let us imagine for a moment that you are right," the inspector suggested rather jovially. "I work for a government department that tries to comprehend that plan. We, mankind, have created a society that allows us the time and the intelligence to observe and study the world we live in, our environment. Call this study what you will, biology, geography, they are the sciences we use every day. We use these sciences to write rules that nature appears to follow to the best of our observations." He waved a hand in the air as he took another drink of tea. "And we can use these rules to formulate and make predictions about what will happen in the future, like—" he thought for a moment, "like weather forecasts and the movement of the planets." "Yes, I see," Aldous nodded, his attention captured. There are times, as we seem to have discovered, when nature decides not to follow these rules, or we stumble upon new discoveries awaiting explanation. In these instances, I, or a colleague of mine, will be sent to investigate the occurrences and try to discover what has happened so that the observations of nature's behaviour can be extended to include the new occurrences. The rule book has not finished being written yet. Aldous nodded. So, you are trying to unravel the plan of God? Aldous asked. We are trying to make sense of the universe, the inspector replied with a smile. That's all very interesting, I'm sure. Are you trying to explain to me how you are in two different places at the same time? I presume that is what you have realised now. The inspector thought hard for a moment. I guess what I am trying to explain is that the universe can be a vast and unnervingly confusing place if you look at it for too long, he continued with a smile. I do not wish to distract you with my pursuits. I am, to be honest, still not entirely sure how I can be here and somewhere else at the same time. This was true. It was still a mystery how he had gotten there. The inspector needed to keep the vicar on side, but he didn't want him to know too much. Not that I don't believe you saw me at the Firestone, he hastened to add. My mind, my body, and my memory are still slowly recovering from whatever happened, but I am still weak. I still don't know what has happened to me, but I would like to try and find out, the inspector informed him. I should think you would, you poor chap, Aldous replied. Though confused himself, he couldn't begin to think how his poor guest was feeling. The inspector rubbed his thickly sprouted beard thoughtfully. Father, may I ask your name? The inspector asked, realising that if he did know he couldn't remember it. Aldous, the vicar replied. Aldous Squires. Aldous, there are different perspectives on the importance of asking favours. What may be of vital importance to the person asking may be of little importance to the person being asked, the inspector mused. Well, yes, quite, Aldous stuttered, wondering what the inspector was about to ask him. It is with this in mind that I must ask you several things, and I list them in the order of inconvenience I consider they will cause you. Aldous, feeling he was now embroiled in something beyond his comprehension, tried to remain businesslike, unsure how to react to the inspector. Go on, he encouraged him cautiously. Firstly, may I stay at your house until Wednesday night? Aldous leant back in his chair, looking thoughtfully out of the window at the movement of the trees. Do I have a choice? He asked. The inspector raised his shoulders into a half shrug. You must decide if you have a choice or not. I will not force you into anything. We all have choices in life. The inspector hoped Aldous was a decent enough man to find he was unable to choose no. What are your other requests, Aldous asked, wanting the full list before making up his mind. Well, secondly, may I borrow some clothes and perhaps some Wellingtons? Third, must ask that you keep my whereabouts a secret, never to be revealed to anyone, not even me, unless I should broach the subject. And lastly, could I have a pen and some paper? I need to write a few things down. Aldous's gaze had not drifted from the swaying of the branches, but now he turned to look the inspector in the eye. Well, I think before I can answer any of those requests, I must ask you some questions. Of course, please do, the inspector replied without hesitation. He was asking rather a lot and expected some conditions. Well, how can I be sure that you are not an impostor, sent to thwart the attempts of the man I met at the Firestone, and all this is not just some elaborate hoax? Good question. An excellent point. You can't, the inspector conceded, though you can also not be sure that he is not the impostor, and that I am actually the real inspector. Aldous thought for a moment. Well, yes, I suppose you're right, he thought for a second. So you admit that you and he are the same person? He asked. Yes, we are, the inspector replied frankly. And your being in two different places at the same time is part of the trouble with the body you're investigating? It is, the inspector replied. Aldous thought for a moment. And do you have any idea how or why all this is connected? He asked incredulously. No, I haven't worked that out yet, he admitted. So you are as in the dark about what you are doing here and how you got here as I am? I am. It was dawning on the inspector that Aldous was quite as astute a fellow as he could have hoped to have found in his current circumstances. Well then, yes, of course you may stay here, he replied without a moment of deliberation. You look as though you've been to hell and back. I will do all I can to help you recover, and to help you work out what in God's name is going on. As to the clothes, I'm afraid I might not have anything to fit you, but I will see what I can find. As to mentioning you to anyone, rest assured your stay here will not go any further. And the pen and paper? The inspector asked eagerly. Yes, of course. He hurried out of the room and returned with a sheaf of paper and a fountain pen, then leant on the table and tested the pen. After a couple of scribbles, the ink began to flow. He replaced the lid and left the pen with the paper. Here, seems to be working all right. Thank you. Well now, shall I show you upstairs to the spare room? You may be a little more comfortable there. The inspector nodded and let Aldous lead the way. I would have put you in it yesterday, but I hadn't the strength to get you up the stairs. The inspector followed him up the small staircase that led to a short hallway with 3 doors. This is the bathroom. Aldous pushed the door on their right open to reveal a small green-tiled room with a bath, a sink and a toilet. "This is my room." Aldous introduced him to the door, but did not open it. "And this is where you will be sleeping." He pushed the spare room door open. It was simple enough. A double bed was pushed against a wall, with a wooden dining chair next to it acting as a bedside table with a lamp balanced on it. A wardrobe stood lazily in one corner. "This room isn't used very much. I don't often entertain visitors," Aldous explained. "I'm afraid it's become somewhat a dumping ground for items I cannot find a home for anywhere else." A box of hymn books sat under the window gathering dust, along with a large black refuse sack full of clothes. "This is left over from our last jumble sale." Aldous picked it up, looking rather embarrassed, which must have been over 2 years ago. Firestone Copse moves at a somewhat slower pace than the rest of the world. "That is no bad thing," the inspector pointed out. "Have you ever considered that perhaps the world moves far too fast, and Firestone is actually travelling at the right pace?" "An interesting thought. Perhaps you're right. I do appreciate the speed here," Aldous replied thoughtfully. "Indeed," the inspector agreed. "Sometimes I feel it is a shame not to appreciate what you have. The grass is not always greener, you know." Aldous smiled. "Well, you may find something in here that fits you." He lifted the bag of jumble onto the bed. "Otherwise, there are some old clothes of mine in the wardrobe. Hopefully you can find something that fits. Feel free to try some things on. I'll leave you to it." "That would be most welcome. I cannot tell you how eager I am to get out of these dirty clothes. Perhaps I could trouble you with a bath and a towel?" "Oh, of course. There are towels in the airing cupboard in the bathroom. I'll turn the hot water on for a bath. You may want to give it 10 minutes. "I will, thank you," the inspector replied gratefully. "Right we are, then." Aldous took his cue to leave and hurried off. Before the latch on the door had clicked shut, the inspector had the black sack open and had begun searching through. It carried the faint musty air of material that has spent too long without human contact. He found it full of men's clothing of a rather older style. There were shirts, trousers, a thick dark blue woolen jumper, and some ties. All the clothes were the same size, as if all belonging to one person. The inspector deduced that the previous owner of these garments had probably died, and a grieving widow had donated her deceased spouse's better clothes to the church. The thought of them being a dead man's clothes did not bother the inspector. He chose a pair of red corduroy trousers that fitted in the waist but were slightly too long in the leg. He swiftly solved that by rolling them up slightly at the ends. With these he wore a plain white shirt that was a little baggy and a little too long in the arm, and the blue jumper. He also found a flat cap, and he picked out the warmest-looking scarf from a pile at the bottom of the bag. In the wardrobe were Aldous' old clothes, all of which were slightly too small for him, but he did find an old sheepskin coat that he could squeeze into. Satisfied with his new ensemble, he removed it again and took a quick bath, shampooing his new beard thoroughly. He also took the opportunity to wash his underwear, which he placed on the radiator in his room to dry. He would have to forego the extra layer for the moment. When he was refreshed, he dressed again and descended the stairs, finding Aldous in the kitchen drinking tea. He looked him up and down. "You look very smart, a new man," he complimented, genuinely surprised at the difference that a bath and a change of clothes could make. "Thank you. These are so much more comfortable than a dirty suit." The inspector was pleased to have found something that had fitted. "If you give your clothes to me, I'll have them cleaned for you," Aldous offered as he poured out a cup for the inspector. "Most kind, thank you," the inspector replied, slightly overwhelmed by the offer. "They are in the spare room. I will see that you are reimbursed on Thursday for any costs incurred." "Oh, no need," Aldous insisted with a fluster, and let the matter drop. "Well, why don't you relax in the living room? It might be more comfortable than these old chairs," Aldous suggested, indicating the dining chairs. "A kind offer, but if you'll excuse me, I feel I need to take a walk. I hope a spot of exercise may clear my mind, help me think. I hope I might also recognise the area and recall how I came to be here." "Of course, good idea, though are you not worried you may be recognised?" Aldous asked with a little concern. "I don't plan to go anywhere near the town, and with my new facial hair and these clothes I doubt anyone will look twice." He put his hat on and pulled it low over his eyes. "Well, if you're sure." Aldous didn't want to stop him, and just hoped he would come back. He found his shoes still near the fire and pulled them on. They had dried nicely and were warm from the flames. Aldous walked him to the front door, drawing back the curtain and unlocking the front door. "See you soon, father." The inspector tipped his new flat cap to him and strolled out into the grey afternoon. "Yes, don't be long," Aldous urged, admitting to himself that he was rather concerned for his welfare. With a belly full of good food, a walk was exactly what the inspector needed to kick-start his metabolism and get the energy flowing. The same questions kept circling around in his mind. How had he gotten here? What had happened on Wednesday night? He set about trying to see a way of calculating what had happened and lapsed into a steady march in concentration. He stomped determinedly up the hill away from the town, with his head down, deep in thought for about 10 minutes when he happened upon a car parked beside the trees. He stopped and stared at it. Somewhere in the tangled fog of his subconscious he recognised it, but what relevance it held he did not know. He glanced around for the car's owner and noticed, almost completely hidden amongst the trunks, there stood a man watching the branches, listening to the trees. The inspector recognised the man as someone he had spoken to, and stood looking at him, trying to place his face. The man stood stock still, save for the occasional sway as the wind blew. The inspector watched him, perplexed as to what he might be doing, though the scene was somehow familiar. The man's identity evaded him, his memory was still struggling to recover. The man suddenly broke the pose and strolled back to his car casually. He climbed in, turned it around, and drove away. The inspector crouched inconspicuously, remaining hidden from him at all times. When he was past, the inspector rose and traced his steps into the trees. He found the space the man had stood in, and searched round the trees thoroughly, peering into the branches to try and fathom what he might have been doing, or what he might have been looking for. As he looked, the trees began to look familiar, and he felt as if he might have been there before. He suddenly remembered the woods, racing through them in the dark, and a memory of the night before was released. He hung on to it for a moment, replaying the brief scene in his mind. He could see the dark, he could feel the cold, unwelcoming trees, and he felt the blind panic, the fear. He remembered the want of escape, and the entrapment of the trees. He came back to the moment, and realised the events of Monday night were coming back to him, and that he must hurry back to the vicarage to try and capture them before they faded again.